Welcome back to Dungeon Brew. Today we're talking about linear and complex storytelling. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Today we're talking about the linear and complex storytelling in TTRPGs. Understanding the difference between them is really going to help GMs bring their game to life for the players. But why don't you start off, Josh, with telling us what a linear plot actually is?
Linear, I appreciate the enunciation on the word because I am not going to say it that way through this entire video, and I'll
The
apologize in advance.
enunciation.
The enunciation. I'm from the Midwest. We don't speak well here. So, a linear plot is one that really is just pretty straightforward in the story that's being told. It's got a clear beginning, a clear middle, a clear end. We're going to be talking about the difference between linear and complex, which I think is really depends on the type of game you're wanting to set up for your TTRPG. But linear ones specifically just have a very clear, straightforward goal in mind that you're wanting your players to achieve. Maybe it's overcoming the BBEG that's wreaking havoc on the world, and you're just wanting to overcome that. It's just having a really set goal and leading them through an adventure that follows that goal.
Yeah, you have your A, your B, and your C. You're getting from A to C in some way. That is the ultimate plan. I think about it in gaming like the old school Zelda games or the Pokemon games. You start out your game, you know who you are, your basic information there. You got to take what you have and get to your purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about plot structure in our last video, and when I think about this in this context, I really do think about the three-act structure. Again, your A, B, C, your Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. In your Act 1, you're introducing the characters and the setting. You're giving some exposition. You're got an inciting incident of some kind that kind of spurs that moment, spurs that action. You move into Act 2. You have some conflict that's there. There's escalating challenges that exist. And then you move into Act 3 with a climax and a resolution. And it's just like quickly moving along this conceptualization of what you want your characters to be doing.
Yeah, you can still have some depth. You could still have, some little pieces moving around, but ultimately it doesn't take you from the point of the storyline or the game.
I think that's really the clear piece with it. Now, when you're starting to look at complexity, what is it that you're doing when you're making this then into a complex story?
You're creating those extra plots on the sides, all these side things that you have to do first to get to the point of, the point of the story. So, we look at things like Game of Thrones. There's all these different pieces that are moving all at the same time to help the story move along, to help the viewer get from point A to point C or the reader or whatever. But going through that process with all of these side plots or subplots and all these parallel stories of all the different characters and their lifestyles, their moving pieces here and there, that would that's the best idea that I could think of right now of complex. That's the most complex I think I've really dived into myself.
No, that's a really good example. I mean, in Game of Thrones, you have the White Walkers that are coming over the wall. There's that immediate inciting incident that creates this need to start finding some way to protect the North and all the lands to the South from these rising dead. But now we have these subplots and these parallel plots that are added into it with, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, Ned Stark's death, the children being scattered across the way, Robb becoming king, Jon Snow being sentenced to the wall, Daenerys, there's all these now subplots and parallel plots that have to move in accordance with the main plot to bring it to an epic conclusion. So not only do you have this Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 that's flowing over the entire story that's being told, you also have it for every subplot and every parallel plot to move like music.
Can it get too complex with TTRPGs? Is
Yeah,
there such a thing?
that's a problem I have. That's a very big problem that I have is that I make it too complex and I start losing track of pieces and my characters go, Josh, but what happened to the little girl that we saved? Or what happened to the king that roamed off into the wilderness? Or you remember this artifact that you dropped in us in Dungeon 2 when we were third level? What does that do? You know, there starts to become so much complexity because I'll have little spurred ideas of like, oh, here's a fun little side quest or a little dungeon or something that I can add into the story, and I forget about it, and then my players bring it back up, or we just never remember it, and we reach the conclusion. It's like, oh, poor little girl, she's lost on a canoe somewhere. But yeah, it can get too complex, especially in the nature of storytelling, because your players will show excitement for certain elements that you include. You might start introducing little pieces out of their backstory to really bring them further into the story, and then you don't build on top of those. Interests leads into different directions, motivations carry you into different directions, and if you're not too careful, the story gets away from you.
How do you do that with TTRPGs? When you, I mean, I understand storytelling, like you have your Excel sheet, you keep things organized in that way, but when it comes to TTRPGs and it's sort of like on the spot changes, how do you keep these things organized?
Yeah, sometimes being a GM is a full-time job, I think, especially if
Sounds
you're
like it.
if you're that invested into it. You know, after you're done rocking in the corner and weeping, I think that you really just have to find yourself a system that's going to work for you. I like to take notes during the course of the game and try to keep track of some of those elements as things are changing, so I can then incorporate them out. I'll put little tags into like, whether I'm writing into like my notebook of like a blank page with the plot piece at the top there so I can follow out that story arc line and make sure that I build it out later is always a good idea. Usually where I struggle with is I don't copy it over. I'll take the notes during gameplay so that I won't forget about it, and it goes onto a sticky note somewhere and I misplace it, and then I forget to ever build anything off of it, and that becomes challenging. But I think that having a set system for you to keep track of those parallel plots that you develop in game or those side quests that you create in game has got to be done. Otherwise, they're into the ether. And
Yeah.
next thing you know, your players are level 15. They're like, what happened? What happened to this thing? It's like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I what comes to mind now is the last time we played a game together with John, that he had the person that kind of keeps track of certain things that happen throughout the game. What were they called again? I can't remember
Yeah,
now.
like the chronicler.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess that's one way to keep those things organized.
Yeah, which is a
Um,
great idea. That TTRPGs, you can have your players have certain roles to help you keep track of that stuff so that you don't forget.
mhm. So how, I guess, trying to think, this is a nice a segue into this question. When it comes to connecting the different plots in complex storytelling, how would you say would be the best way to do that in TTRPGs as a GM?
It's tying those subplots and those parallel plots back into the main plot line so that there's always a purpose and a reason behind them that brings that plot back to the forefront of your players' minds, to the characters' minds, so that it's like, oh, this is happening because we haven't yet dealt with this threat.
Yeah, so it's that primary focus. It's the main problem is always just kind of having to be there on that golden pedestal, glowing throughout the whole process of the game or the story.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. And this is an issue that you see happen a lot in TTRPGs where players get kind of pulled off onto a side quest that takes a life of its
Mhm.
own and they just abandon the main quest line. It's just like, well, White Walkers are going to eat everybody, but I'm out here across the sea where it's safe, and I'm just going to, manage my little business and go adventuring into the dungeons and go dungeon delving. Or I'm going to step into another plane of existence and just never go back to the mainland because it's screwed. Like they just kind of venture off and no longer care about whatever that main plot was that
And then you kick out the player and kill them off,
all of them be like,
right?
yeah, then he just died.
Well, I mean, if they just kind of dive off the side there, doesn't that kind of break the story arc then? Doesn't that pull you out of the entire, I mean, it pulls you out of the whole thing. How do you bring them back if you don't just kill off your player?
You may not bring them back, honestly. You and I talked about this a little bit in our previous videos about redirecting the story in a way that's meaningful to the players. So you may just redo the story arc, you may take them on a different adventure. Clearly, your initial story was just not engaging enough to keep them immersed or to keep them wanting to come back to that plot. So you might have to then just go back to the drawing board. You're going to take out different plot elements, move them around, create a new story arc, and take your characters down that path, and maybe not in the initial story that you did. That's kind of the fun, again, about TTRPGs. I'm not stuck within the course of a video game where I have to play this story. And a TTRPG is a story that's being told by everyone around the table. And if your players happen to go in a different direction, that might just be the story that you're now telling. You know, have fun with it and keep it engaging for them. But if you really want them to defeat the White Walkers, then, you know.
Yeah. I'm curious now, and this is kind of I guess might be a little out of the blue, but lit RPGs, how can I guess would you I'm trying to think like how would lit RPGs go into this? I'm at this moment sitting here thinking about the writing aspect and the gaming aspect and how to bring them together in this idea of, I mean, would it have to be a complex storyline if it was a lit RPG?
Not necessarily. I mean, lit RPGs I've read that are both pretty linear, where they don't have a lot of complexity to them, and then also ones that have quite a bit of complexity. So, lit RPG, for those that are not familiar, is an area of writing where individuals are essentially writing about characters who are in a game, who oftentimes know that they're in a game or in some sort of simulation where they're able to level up and improve their attributes to continue throughout the story that's being told. Some of these are rather linear in nature, where it's just them trying to accomplish a goal. Other ones can be more complex, where again you have those subplots and parallel plots along with them, where they get pulled off in a different direction. But in this case, you are within the framework of the story being told. So I can't imagine that you would just go off into left field. You know, it'd be like, well, we started off with this idea in our first act, and by the third act, we completely forgotten about why this story actually started and what they're trying to achieve. It's going to have to fit probably your basic story structure model.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious if that was anything different. I know you had experience with writing one, and somebody had brought it up yesterday or a few days ago. The idea of me getting into lit RPGs. I'm like, I don't know that I would know how to do that, but that's where my mind went. But before we go on or finish this, I wanted to remind the viewer here, if you are enjoying our content, please go ahead and like and subscribe to this to our channel. Click that little bell so you'll be notified of all of our future videos. Did we cover everything we wanted to talk about?
I think that we really did. I mean, the big piece with this is that just knowing that linear is pretty direct, and complex is just adding more, again, parallel and subplots to that are going to fit along the same progression of your primary storyline. There's a lot of great examples that you can look at in video games and movies and other games that kind of follow this. And so it's finding something that's going to inspire you to really make the game as complex as you want. And I think your warning with this is don't make it so complex that you start losing track of what it is that you're doing and the purpose behind why you're playing the game.
Yeah, and be careful with linear and don't make it too boring. You also want to create some depth. You know, you can still have that depth with linear as well, and it's important to keep the story going.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.